Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to another Johnny's Ambassadors Expert webinar series for parents. We are joined here today by Matthew Quinn, whom I will introduce in just a moment after I run through some logistics. We are pleased to present this series of webinars for Johnny's Ambassadors, where we educate parents and teens about the dangers of today's high THC marijuana on adolescent brain development, mental illness, and suicide. This session is being recorded. It will be available on our website. Please share it with other parents and people who have young ones in their lives. There is a handout in the control panel today. Matthew has graciously provided a copy of his slides, so you can access that under the handouts section. We will also be doing a Q&A at the end of today's webinar. Matt will give about a 45-minute presentation. So as you think of questions, please type them into the question box, and we will use the last part of our webinar for me to ask him your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Matt Quinn, who provides community relations for Rosecrance Health Network in the Chicagoland area. He completed his bachelor's degree in psychology at the University of Notre Dame and master's degree in clinical psychology at the Illinois School of Professional Psychology. Matt is a licensed clinical professional counselor, LCPC, and he's a certified alcohol and drug counselor, CADC, in Illinois. He has been counseling adolescents and adults in individual, couples, and family counseling for the past 15 years. Matt, thank you so much for being one of Johnny's ambassadors.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate the opportunity. I love the idea of honoring Johnny by presenting this incredibly valuable information, and thank you for having me and for providing this education and service for everybody else out there.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, just real briefly, just to add on to my background. So like Laura mentioned, I've been working with teens for the past 15 plus years. So what I'm going to talk about today in terms of all the research that I've found out there on teen brain development and the impact of marijuana. This is a real passion area for me just because of what I've gotten to witness over the years and the hundreds of kids that I've worked with and the impact that I've seen on what marijuana can do to their functioning. And I think there's a lack of information. I feel like that a lot of parents, a lot of kids don't know a lot of the information I want to talk about or the other presentations that have been done. So I think it's important really to spread the word about this, and please take any of this information and spread the word, because it's really, really important that this information get out there. So just briefly, I do want to run through what we're going to talk about today in terms of the objectives. I'm going to jump around a little bit. I'm actually going to start more so on bullet point 2 and 3, just talking about how adolescent brain development works and just some of the bullet points of it. I won't get too far in the weeds with it. I won't get too far into the science of it. I want to make it relatable. And then we'll kind of talk about how marijuana impacts that teen brain development. And then I'll actually circle back to that first bullet point and get kind of more on the chemical level in terms of how marijuana actually impacts the brain itself and produces its effects. And then also I'll sprinkle in some of the newer research in terms of marijuana use, especially higher potency marijuana use, and how it increases risk for schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders. So this slide might throw you off in talking about teen brain development. You might be wondering, why am I showing a slide of someone pouring concrete? Some of you might be able to jump ahead a little bit and probably get a sense of maybe why I'm showing somebody pouring wet concrete. It's probably not the first thing in your mind when we talk about teen brain development or marijuana, but very quickly, I think you'll understand why I'm moving through this. So you have workers here that are pouring the concrete and starting to smooth it out. They take a trowel, start to smooth it out, and they get to this point, right? And this is the point where I want to pause for a minute, because if you look at this sidewalk, if you look at it, you can see the sheen that kind of indicates that it's wet concrete. Now, I don't know about all of you, but if this were my home, this were my place of business, and this concrete had just been finished, I would be like a hawk. I would be sitting at the far end of it. I'd be sitting on the side. I would be walking around it. I don't want anybody touching this concrete. I want it to dry as smoothly as possible without any interference. So as you could probably imagine, this is my analogy with the adolescent brain. Whether you're talking about a child's brain or a 12, 13, 14, 15, really up to 25, this is what we're talking about. And so, you know, as parents, what I'm encouraging you to do is really do what you can to protect this. And I think a lot of parents out there don't understand the connection between marijuana, alcohol, and other drugs and what the impact that it can have. And certainly as parents, we can't do everything to prevent our kids from stepping in the wet concrete like this image shows. But it's important to try to do everything we can to understand first and foremost that marijuana being the topic today, and we're going to focus on that, it really does impact brain development in a way. Now, I want to go back for a quick second for something I forgot to mention. Now, after a day, 2 days, a week, a month, if someone were to walk on this, you're going to have a whole different outcome, right? That's analogous to an adult brain, 25, 30, 40. Now, if that person hasn't used any alcohol, any other drugs, and let's say at the age of 30, they decide to try alcohol, they tried marijuana, is that going to have the same impact as a teenager? No, because that concrete, in this case the brain, will be fully developed and formed. And sure, there's going to be side effects and maybe problems that come from their use, but it's going to have nowhere near the damaging impact that marijuana will. And I'll get into the details behind that. So when I show this last slide, a question sometimes that I'll get is, well, if a teenager uses marijuana, let's say, just once, what if they just use it a few times? Is this going to create permanent brain damage, or will it repair? And the good news with this is that really this slide is more meant to represent regular use, heavy use. That's in no way to condone any use, because I think any use with teens can cause problems. But if you have a teen that uses once, uses a few times, and then stops, and doesn't use after that, there's a lot of neuroplasticity is the term. There's a lot of ability to bounce back. But if they continue to use throughout adolescence, that's where you'll see some of these problems that I'm going to talk about that can be a little bit more ingrained and that can be a little bit more enduring. And that's why when I have kids that I work with that maybe have had some history of regular use and they're, say, 16, I do focus, and it's important to talk about the ability of the brain to bounce back, because otherwise they might give up hope. They might shrug their shoulders and say, why bother? So it's really important that they understand they can bounce back, but that it's so important that they stop so that they don't continue to do further damage and cause these footprints or other things to form fully in that concrete. So I've just found that metaphor, that analogy, to be helpful with parents and with teens, to try to make it a little bit more understandable about how their brain is different than an adult's. So let me get into how this compares specifically with the brain and what that adolescent brain development looks like that might be different than adults. And there's really three things I'm going to talk about. Synaptogenesis, which is really a fancy term for brain cell development, connections between brain cells. Myelination is a coating that goes over brain cells that can cause transmission to be faster and more efficient. And the last one, apoptosis, is a pruning process that I'm really going to talk about probably more than these other three. It's a natural process that happens through adolescence, where the brain naturally starts to understand which parts of the brain are being used. If it's a musician, the parts of the brain that relate to music are going to be still pretty active, versus if it's a teenager that through their teenage years they don't use that part of the brain. Those brain cells will be trimmed because it's going to specialize. It'll make the brain more efficient by really sharpening and developing those synapses in those brain cells that are related to what's being used, and maybe start to prune some of the rest. Okay, so we talked mostly about this, so I'll skip over this. So this is kind of an important connection between when we talk about marijuana. I'm going to start to weave in kind of how marijuana impacts this. So there's a growing body of research, and I do want to say this before I forget, that most of the research I'm going to talk about is going to certainly be pointing in the direction of how marijuana negatively impacts brain development. But I don't want to make it sound like every piece of research out there is conclusive. There's some inconclusive research, some research that says that maybe there's not as much of a correlation. This really, if I've looked at, say, 50 pieces of research of marijuana and brain development, most of it is indicative that it does cause problems. But I think it's important that you look at the whole and not just look at one single study, but look at the whole. And by me looking at the whole, I'm convinced, and I'll get in a little bit to kind of my personal experience and my professional experience more so in terms of what I've seen working with teenagers and how it relates to this. And my kids are younger. My oldest daughter is 12. And based on my own experience, based on my professional experience, based on all the research, I've concluded that I'm going to do everything I can to prevent use because of what I've seen and the research that I've found. So in terms of gray matter, what they're finding is that marijuana correlates with a decrease or lower amount of gray matter relative to white matter in this area called the orbitofrontal or occipital frontal cortex. Orbito is the orbit bone, that circular bone that's behind near your eyes. So we're talking about the part of the brain that's behind the eyes. And really that ratio of having a proper ratio of gray matter to white matter in that area is really important in terms of good impulse control, decision making, learning. And when there is a lower amount of gray matter relative to white matter, it can correlate with all kinds of problems relative to social problems, occupational, psychological, school, legal. All these problems tend to correlate with a lower ratio of gray matter, and they're finding that to be the case. And there's always the chicken and the egg dilemma, which came first, the lower gray matter or the marijuana use. But either way, there tends to be that lower amount when there's marijuana that's in the picture. So the theory, and I'm going to talk about this, kind of looks like a tree or roots of a tree. This is kind of a really magnified dendrite or brain cell. And this is really important because one theory that's really gaining steam is that because of this off ratio or this decrease in gray matter, that the brain may compensate by actually accelerating this process that I talked about of increasing brain cells, increased pruning, increased myelination, accelerate that to accommodate the decrease in gray matter. The body's always trying to seek homeostasis, right? If you have the flu, you get the chills to get your body to create a fever to try to kill the virus. Or it's always, if you take more and more of a drug, you build tolerance, and then your body doesn't produce as much of those neurotransmitters because it's getting it from an outside source. So it's important to recognize that the body may be accelerating because it's saying, okay, we don't have as much gray matter, we need to accelerate the growth of these other parts of the brain. The problem is by accelerating that pruning process, what you end up having is over time, by accelerating that, you have a lot of these, and this is another example of a brain cell, you have a lot of instances where because that pruning is getting accelerated, you may, and this is why I think it relates to some of these other problems that I'm going to talk about, you may, instead of it being really extensive like this, you'll have a brain through the teenage years, if there's that less gray matter or more marijuana use, you'll have less of these extensive branches, right? Because that pruning process has been accelerated. It should kind of come along at a slow pace, but it might be accelerated because the brain is trying to overcompensate for that lower gray matter. That's kind of one of the growing theories that's starting to get some research backing. There's also some indications and some studies out there, and this is one of the studies that really opened my eyes. This goes all the way back to 2014, back when I was doing an IOP, study that came out that was a coordination with Harvard University, Northwestern University, Massachusetts General Hospital, where they looked at teen brains and they compared teen brains of those that didn't use marijuana and those that did on a regular basis, and they found that there were consistently more abnormalities at the second bullet point here in some really key regions of the brain related to memory and emotion and anxiety, motivation, appetite, stress, muscle coordination. And really what was so striking to me about this research, and this is the actual physical development of these parts of the brain that is likely being impacted by marijuana use, is the actual physical structure. A lot of these are P-shaped or almond-shaped, where they were finding some of them misshapen or less dense than they should be, smaller. So there's actually, what's looking like is the possibility that marijuana is actually impacting the actual physical growth of some of these key regions of the brain. And what's so important is that if you look at some of the patterns that develop, and this is what I've seen in hundreds and hundreds of kids that I've worked with, is you start to see a pattern in functionality. If there's regular marijuana use, you see struggles with motivation. You see what might look like an anxiety disorder or a mood disorder. Memory problems are often typically part of that. And so what was so striking to me is that constellation of symptoms that you see really mirrors very closely which parts of the brain are being negatively impacted by, or the growth is being impacted. So to me, it's compelling when you see these parts of the brain that are being impacted, that it makes sense that that aspect of functioning would be impaired at the same time. So that's when kind of the ceilings of me doing presentations like this, I didn't envision doing it in front of a screen back then. It was more so maybe in front of a larger audience of people. COVID's kind of having that impact, but it really it made me feel compelled to share this information because of the close overlap between what some of the research is indicating and what we're seeing out there with kids that are developing this habit with their marijuana use. So these next few slides are really, in my mind, some of the functional and behavioral and psychological impact that is a trickle down from the impact that marijuana has on the brain and brain development. I do want to talk about the reward center, this area that's kind of centered around the nucleus accumbens, or that motivation center. Because what can happen with marijuana, particularly with kids that may have a history of trauma, or there might be the family history of substance use where they may have a genetic predisposition toward progressing with their substance use. What marijuana can do, and this is true with alcohol or other drugs, is it can really mess with that, we call that hierarchy of needs for those Psych 101 people out there, that Maslow hierarchy needs, or that really the kind of what your brain interprets as being key to survival, right? It should be water and food and shelter, right? And if drugs are introduced during those teenagers, what can happen is it can throw off, or it can because those needs can be shifted during the teenagers, or the brain can be tricked to shift around those needs, and a drug like marijuana can be slotted in above food or just below food, in terms of where it can trick the brain's reward center into thinking it's needed just as much as food or just as much as water. And so when we see kids that are using it, it's not always about that they're trying to cause problems or that they're trying to cause, legal issues or school issues. A lot of times, if they do it enough, they're slowly starting to trick their brain into thinking that this is something that's needed on the same level of, whereas with an adult, if they do it, they're not, that hierarchy is oftentimes more set in stone: water, food, shelter, etc., right? Whereas with teens, the drugs can really trick the brain into thinking that it's that drug is more of a need than it is something that's a want. Changes in mood, that amygdala, again, we see it all the time, where marijuana use can mimic a depressive disorder, where it can mimic an anxiety disorder. And I think it's important for professionals to really look closely at that, because otherwise what I've seen time after time is where you'll have a teen that gets prescribed a anti-anxiety medication or an anxiety or anti-depressant medication or anti-anxiety medication, when in fact it's the marijuana over time that's really causing those. So it's really important to eliminate that first, so we can get a baseline of understanding if there are potentially underlying mental health conditions. We talked about the hippocampus and memory. We'll talk a little bit more in terms of psychosis and the increased risk for psychosis. Now, one thing we're not going to talk about as much, but I consider to be, when we talk about teenage use, I always like to talk about these two pillars of why it's, whether it's parents I'm talking to or teens, there's really two key pillars to why it's so important that they not use. One of them is brain development, and we're getting all into that, so we're covering that. The other one is and it's tied into brain development. The other one I'm not going to talk about it as much is the risk for progression of use to more use to harder drugs, right? And this is where the research is a little bit more conclusive, where the younger a teen or child starts to use alcohol, marijuana, any other drug, the more likely they are to progress to other drugs. And it's really fascinating that almost all people, 90% of adults that develop some more severe substance use disorder began before the age of 18. That's not, now I'm not saying at the age of 18 that's a free pass, because there still is that 18 to 25-year-old brain development that still puts the youth at risk. But it goes to show in that, you know, through childhood and really that 13 to 18-year-old age range is really critical with that brain development that we talked about earlier, where it's the most susceptible to developing a more significant substance use issue. If you talk about in that 13 to 12 to 14-year-old age range, you're talking about 40%. So almost a 50-50 chance if a teen starts using at that age that they might develop a more severe substance use disorder. That is striking to me, and why it's so critical that Laura and I were talking about sixth grade, 12-year-old, 13-year-old education, why it's so important to really provide this education for kids and parents at that age, because that's really where the tipping point is, not only with where kids might be more likely to start to experiment, but where that risk level is so high at that age. And then as every year that goes by, it goes down more, but it's still, you could see even at 17, it's 25%, 21 at 10%. So it's really important through those years in terms of preventing progression that kids not use if at all possible. Something we're seeing more and more every year that goes by is the potency of marijuana going up. I'm not going to get too much into that because this is more about brain development, but we are seeing, whether it's at schools, at hospitals, we're seeing a new host of symptoms and side effects that are emerging because of the potency of marijuana out there, where it's not just a lack of coordination, it's not just memory issues, but you're talking about acute psychosis. You're talking about kids that may use these dabs or these waxes, where if they use it in the school, some of them can't find their way to their next class. They're so out of it. They can't find their way out of the school. They end up having to go to the DD because the ED because they're having a panic attack, because they're delusional. It could distort perceptions, paranoia. It invites this whole other level of almost kind of borderline psychosis that can start to emerge because of the potency. So I think it's important to recognize that and use that as kind of caution or to make people aware of that. I want to talk for just a couple minutes about marijuana and psychosis. There's great research out there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And my hope is that as I was putting these slides together and doing this research, I really think there's a lot of great opportunity as genetic testing, as genetic research starts to emerge, that we can even look at children, middle school age kids, and be able to test for some of these variants that we're going to talk about here that really put young people, and it's about 20 to 25% of kids, that really put them in a different category of risk based on some of these variants with these AKT1 genes and these COMT enzymes. And I'm not going to get too much into detail with that because it could be confusing, and it even confuses me with some of the biochemistry behind it and some of the genetics behind it. But just to simplify, so an AKT1 gene, that codes for dopamine signaling. Dopamine is that neurotransmitter that's involved in a lot of pleasure responses, okay? And a lot of just general mood regulation, anxiety regulation. And then you have the COMT enzyme, which degrades that dopamine, and norepinephrine, which is another neurotransmitter. So I want to talk a little bit about the three variants for each one and how they present with risk. So there's really three different types of these AKT1 variants. TT, again, I'm not going to get into what TT, there's too much other information I want to present to get too far into that, but there's basically three types of variants: TT, CT, and CC. And the CC is really what I want to focus on. And like I said, that represents about 20 to 25% of people. So it's a significant number. We're not talking about 1%, we're talking about a fairly significant number, okay? And how it correlates with psychosis, where it's teenage use and then correlating with later adult or later teen psychosis. So you can see that where teenagers are particularly vulnerable is with the everyday cannabis use or the heavy use. If you have a young person, a teenager that has that CC variant and they're using marijuana every day, their risk, you could see here, of developing some type of a psychotic disorder, whether it be schizophrenia or a variant of that, is 7 times higher, 7 times higher. So we need to know this. We need to understand this. And what's interesting about this research, like for instance, where this came from, you might see this and think, wow, this is really cutting edge. This is new research. This is from 2012. And so this goes to show you that this information is not getting out there enough. And that's why I do what I do, is because a lot of this information is hidden in great research journals, but it's not getting transferred. The information isn't getting effectively transferred into popular culture like it needs to, because if it did, I think we would already have genetic testing out there for the CC variant, and we would be able to, for kids that had that, we would have all kinds of support services and have appropriate messaging for the parents, for the kid, to really emphasize the red flag and the emphasis that we need to put on prevention in terms of not using marijuana, because their risk is so high. But we're not seeing that because it's that information isn't getting disseminated enough. So this is that COMT. I want to talk about some of the variants there. So again, with this third one, this VAL variant versus the other two, it represents roughly 20 to 25% of people that are out there. Again, you could see if there's no marijuana use, you could see that they're as low risk as anybody. But if there's any marijuana use, then you're talking about really a big jump. In all of these, there's a jump in the risk for psychosis with marijuana use. But look at the jump with that VAL. So we want to test for these variants. We want to be able to, so I'm hoping presentations like this, there's people out there that will pass this information along, and all of a sudden there will be a surge of a demand for developing these research and testing for this. There might even be a way for people to test for this now. I don't know. So I do want to back it up a little bit and kind of talk about the first bullet point when we talked about the objectives, and talk a little bit about how marijuana really does kind of interact more specifically with the brain and brain cells, and that kind of lock and key type interaction. So this is the chemical delta 9 tetrahydrocannabinol. For those of you like myself that struggled with biochemistry and organic chemistry in college, we have benzene rings here, and I'm not going to get into all of the details behind it, just because that's not my area of expertise. I did want to focus on a few dates, and I'm not a big dates person, but I think it's important when we talk about the endocannabinoid system to talk about dates. So 1964 was when THC was first identified. Now in 1988, so it took a good almost 25 years later, where they found the site in the brain where marijuana kind of is that key that locks into the site. And because they associated, when they found it, they saw that it locked with THC, they called it a cannabinoid receptor, like cannabis. Now, the problem with that is 4 years later, they actually found that there was another, what's called endogenous, or already within our bodies, neurotransmitter called anandamide, which locks into that as well. The problem is that the term endocannabinoids, or cannabinoid receptors, at that point had already kind of gotten out there and became part of the research language that stuck. That I wish it had gone the other way around and they called it an anandamide receptor, because by calling it a cannabinoid receptor, what it does is it opens up, and this is a conversation I've had with young people, where they say, see, we have these cannabinoid receptors in our brain. We were meant to use marijuana. Now, as adults or professionals, we might say, well, that's kind of a ridiculous thing. But in the mind of an adolescent, there's a certain logic behind that. But if we were to call them anandamide receptors, and that there were already endogenous or built into a neurotransmitter that we already have in our body that locks into that keyhole, then it makes more sense. No, we're not born to use cannabis. We already have this in our body. It's just that that outside cannabis just happens to fit into that lock and key, which I'll talk about in this second. The endocannabinoid system within the body is really kind of hard to pinpoint. It really has, and when I talk about a dimmer switch, I forgot to mention that, some of you might see that. I use the term dimmer switch when it comes to that anandamide, because that's the best way to view it. It maintains homeostasis. It can really kind of tweak or modify all different regions of the brain, from the brain digestive system, immune system, all these different, so it has a wide-ranging impact, and there's receptors all throughout the body. It's not just in the brain. It can regulate, you can see here, it can regulate appetite, sleep, mood, immune function, homeostasis. So really, that's the best way to think of anandamide. That internal neurotransmitter is kind of a thermostat, something that maintains homeostasis throughout all parts of the body. Now, in terms of what makes them different, because we all know with anandamide in a system, not everybody's walking around high, right? Anandamide has a much shorter effect. It detaches from that lock much faster, breaks down faster, whereas THC, which produces that high, it really latches onto that receptor for a longer period of time before it breaks down, so it produces more of an exaggerated effect. One good way to think of anandamide, a lot of people think of endorphins, which is alongside this, but anandamide plays a role as well, is that kind of runner's high, or that feeling that some of you may get after a good workout, particularly cardiovascular exercise. There's anandamide that's released. So some of the anti-anxiety effects that come from that, some of that is due to that effect of anandamide regulating our anxiety levels and other bodily functions through its release through exercise. So just for visual, this is a simplified visual. So the THC receptor that you can see latching onto the receptor, that'll stay in there a lot longer than an anandamide will. And so that's why anandamide is much more subtle, because it breaks off and breaks down a lot faster, whereas THC has that more exaggerated effect and produces that high that comes along with it. So there's two different types. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because there's a lot I want to get to still. CB1 and CB2 receptors. So CB is just short for cannabinoid. CB1 receptors are the ones in the central nervous system, in the brain, spinal cord. Those are responsible for that high, but also for maintaining homeostasis, inflammation, pain and inflammation regulation, stuff with the GI tract, like I said, the high, and can create, those cannabinoid receptors can create some of that drug-seeking behavior that we see with addiction and other substance use disorders. There's a whole host of other CB2 or kind of peripheral cannabinoid receptors that are in all different parts of the body that can regulate immune function, inflammatory response in the GI tract. And that's where, you know, with CBD and other non-THC based chemicals, that there is the possibility of medicinal value. We see that with, a good example of that is with some of the uses for epilepsy, childhood epilepsy. When you have the pure CBD, which is the non-psychoactive chemical that they can extract, it can have a regulatory effect, which can be medicinal. For instance, with epilepsy, you have overactive electrical activity in the brain and other parts of the body, and CBD can have that impact of kind of, like I said, that dimmer switch, that homeostasis. It can kind of tone down that over electrical activity and actually can reduce or eliminate some of those seizures. And so I want to make sure that I emphasize that with CBD in particular and how it interacts with these receptors, there is medicinal value, and they're finding that, and there will continue to be. I'm focusing more on the THC, on the teenage brain, and how overwhelmingly that's going to have more of a negative impact than the CBD and some of its medicinal components. So just briefly, in terms of that initial physiological response, when marijuana is vaped or smoked, it's very fast. We're talking about just a few minutes. It passes through the lungs into the bloodstream into the brain, and those effects can last anywhere from an hour to 3 hours. The main thing I want to talk about with this is how, if marijuana is consumed, whether it's through a beverage or through edibles or whatever the case may be, there's going to be a much more delayed effect, where it could be 30 minutes to an hour before that starts to kick in. And that's important to recognize, because with young people in particular, if they are vaping it or smoking it, they're used to it having that impact very quickly. And so it can, with edibles, because it can take a long time, they may take more because they think it may not be working after 5, 10, 15 minutes, and they take more and more and more, and all of a sudden it hits them very, very hard after. And that's where you'll see a lot of trips to the ED and some of those psychotic features, is where it's been consumed. A lot of it's been consumed, and all of a sudden it hits all at once, and we start to see that happen. So that's just a cautionary tale of how edibles relate to vaping or smoking it. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm just going to pass through this, just in terms of all the impact it has on memory, thinking, concentration, perception, coordination, and movement, all of those types of things. Dopamine, I do want to mention that because really any drug, including marijuana, when you consume THC, it's going to increase the level of dopamine. Dopamine is really the brain's kind of primary pleasure neurotransmitter. It's the one that gets released and creates a lot of those feel-good chemicals. So if we're going to talk about brain development and the impact of marijuana on the brain, is critical to at least in passing mention dopamine and the impact that it has on that high and on that brain piece. This is just a great chart that kind of shows overall all the, I always kind of describe marijuana as kind of a carpet bomb to the brain for teenagers, because I'll hear teenagers say, I get this all the time, where they say, well, they want me to take this medication for my depression. They want me to take this medication for my anxiety. Why can't I take marijuana instead? And the best way I have, simplest way I have to explain it is that those medications are very targeted towards specific neurotransmitters or specific parts of the brain, whereas marijuana is having, yes, you may get some initial relief for anxiety or mood or those things, but unfortunately, it's also having this very far-reaching impact on other parts of the brain that you can see here. Look at all these different parts of the brain that are affected by marijuana and the effects. Sure, there's the neuronucleus accumbens in that feel good, that euphoria, but there's also a whole host of other side effects, especially over time. With teens, a lot of these, the way I always describe it is the short-term gain for the long-term cost. Kids, they often use marijuana because it feels good, but what I try to really educate on is there's a much larger long-term cost that comes along with that in terms of other parts of the brain and impairing the functioning of those other parts of the brain that they're not thinking about, and oftentimes that parents aren't thinking about. So it's important to really connect the dots on that and provide that education. So just briefly, I won't talk too much about this because I already talked about it, and this is kind of starts to bleed into a different presentation. But it is important to acknowledge that I'm aware that there's a lot of good research out there on CBD, and I think it will continue to grow in terms of its potential benefits and its ability to be an effective dimmer switch for people with gastrointestinal issues like IBS, how it can kind of dim down or tone down some of that overactivity, or like I talked about with epilepsy. So I think there's a lot of potential with that, and I certainly encourage further exploration and research on that. But with that, with CBD, it's dangerous, and I always tell people to buyer beware. There's not, especially stuff that's sold in gas stations, and a lot of that's not lab tested. And there's not a lot of research still out there, so you'll have people that are taking CBD for back pain and other conditions where the research still isn't out there yet. So I always encourage people to really do their research and make sure if they're taking it for something, that they're not just taking it and to hope that it'll work, that they're taking it because there's a developing research base that indicates that that's something that's appropriate for them to take. So marijuana and immune function. We're just going to keep rolling along here. Let me just check on time just to see how we're doing. Okay, this should work out good. We have about 7 more minutes left because I do want to try to wrap up around about 45 after, or 15 minutes too, to be able to open up for questions. So there's, just like with all of this, there's a growing body of research that marijuana has a negative impact on immune function. A lot of this is lab tests done on rats because there's ethics behind this, where you can't just necessarily pump in IV doses of marijuana with young people, just because a lot of the studies with young people are done oftentimes after the fact, where they've already made that decision to use, and we can look at their brains and their functioning after the fact. We can't give THC to young people in the name of science, but with rats we can, and we can certainly, there's not a one-to-one correlation, but we can look at some of the impacts that it has on lymphocytes and other parts of immune function that are going to correlate a little bit more closely with how that impact might affect humans as well. And so they're finding it inhibits T lymphocytes and antibodies and all these things that are related to immune function. So, I've talked lately the past year, about COVID and how, there's some good research. I think one research study done out in Stanford where they're finding that there's more of a risk for young people to be symptomatic with COVID if they have more extensive marijuana use in their history. And that matches with the science that marijuana use very well could be compromising their immune function and make them more likely to exhibit the symptoms related to COVID versus not having those and moving through that a little bit more smoothly. So marijuana in driving, this is something that I see regularly that's very, very concerning to me. And it seems to be kind of an urban myth out there that really has gotten rooted among young people and is proving to be very difficult to shift. This idea that that young people today have a great perception of marijuana and driving being harmful, but there are a lot of people out there that think driving under the influence of marijuana is less harmful or even safe. Whereas just like with all this other research, there's a growing body that indicates that it's different than alcohol. There tends to be more aggressive driving with alcohol, but that in terms of coordination, tracking, perception, vigilance, all these things with marijuana use, particularly heavy marijuana use, that it really does have a significant impact on driving performance and reaction time, in particular, slowing reaction time, things that are really, really important to navigate traffic in a way that's safe. Like I mentioned, it is dose dependent. So if someone uses a lot, it's gonna have a much stronger impact on their driving ability. But I think it's critical that we really utilize any of this information and get this out there in health classes and as parents to get kids to understand and try to correct that misconception out there amongst young people that it's safe to be high while they're driving. So just in the last few minutes here, I do want to wrap up. This is just a sample of some of the sources I use that are going to be included in this. If you want to reach out to me, please feel free to do that. My email isn't in here. I could just give it to you because it's the same rosecrans.org. Email address is just mquinn, so just MQUINN at rosecrance.org. I would please ask all of you, if you have time, just check out our website. It's real easy, rosecrans.org. For those of you, I think there are probably a lot of you out there that aren't from the Illinois area, just because Laura and her team are out in Colorado, that we are a nonprofit treatment agency that's centered in the Northern Illinois, Chicagoland area. We have over 60 sites in that area, residential treatment for teens and adults, primarily substance use focused, but also residential for mental health as well. We can offer free assessments and screenings. In Illinois, we take both public and private insurance. We can be a great resource for teens or for parents out there that might be starting to develop some of these substance use issues. We want to be a resource. We want to assess. We want to treat. We want to try to help where we can. So please check out our website. There's an opportunity to, if you want to put an inquiry in, you can put that in terms of connecting with us online. You could call, you could reach out to me. I'm happy to assist and provide any more education around this, steer you in the right direction. If any of this is of particular interest to you, I want to make sure that we're providing that as well. So that's the end of my slides. So I'll invite Laura back in, and we can start with some of the questions, if that's okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt. We do have a lot of questions, so I will try to zip through these, and we'll see if we can answer as many as possible. And Johnny's ambassadors are all over the US and global, so appreciate knowing about the resources that you have there at Rosecrans. Okay, if a kid vapes pretty regularly, THC, from the age of 13 to 15 and then stops, has there been a ton of irreparable damage done, or can such a kid's brain recover 90%, 95%? What's the percentage there? After 5 months of being clean and sober, I see my son has returned in many ways and is regaining interest in school and soccer. So is there a percentage that you can assign to what harm has been done?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mostly can speak anecdotally. There's not a lot of research out there on that because it's hard to get enough kids together that are, because a lot of the research is done after the fact, but just based on my 15 plus years of experience, anecdotally, hundreds of kids that I work with, what I've noticed is that, and this is probably intuitive, is that the younger they stop, the more their brain is going to bounce back. In other words, if you're talking about a 15-year-old that's used since 13 and they stop at 15, I would say you're probably going to get a good 90% of recovery of that. Versus if the use continues up to 17, I would say that you're unfortunately maybe that you're still probably get 70 of that back, but you're not going to get the same level back intuitively, right? And that's what I've seen happen. And that's why it's so critical that if a teen is starting down this road, that intervention happen as early as possible so that you can maximize that neuroplasticity and get as much of that brain bounce back as possible.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Yep.
Someone here is providing a quote from the U.S. Surgeon General who says, I have a 15, a 13, and a 9-year-old, and I absolutely, as a physician, as a dad, and as the Surgeon General of the United States, wouldn't want them exposed to marijuana products and wouldn't want them to falsely believe they're safe. So someone just providing that comment.
I love it.
Let's see, 12 to 14 is the age that so many of our kids are getting into vaping on middle school campuses. So sad. The schools are just not watching this at all. And it gets even worse when the kids get to 9th grade in high school, which is when my son Johnny first started experimenting. It's very frustrating. We feel powerless and are actually grateful that COVID kept our kid away from school and those other kids pulling him in. There has to be much greater national effort in middle schools and from educators to weed out, that's funny, nice pun, from every single school. I know that sounds unrealistic, but we have to start and try. He says, thank you. This webinar is so important, but so painful to hear. Do you have a comment on that, Matt?
Yeah, I do. Because it's a universal problem all around the country is vaping, and in particular, young people getting into vaping via tobacco. And even more particular is getting into vaping via flavored tobacco. So if anybody really wants to put their concerted effort into anything, and this is where when I talk about vaping, which is a whole other presentation, I really talk about flavors, because if we're able to get, and they've done a great job with Juul, and Juul is, if they're headed toward being out of business, because the federal government did a good job of banning flavors about a year ago, banning flavors and the replaceable pod-based devices like Juul. The problem is that they didn't ban flavors across the board. So what happened was it opened up this whole different industry. It just shifted from the replaceable products to these disposable products, which hidden in the legislation, there's still a window of opportunity for disposable products to still be flavored. So we need to target, this needs to be our target, it's such a gateway point for young people in middle school, is the watermelon flavored, the creme brulee flavored, all of these flavored nicotine products, that's where they're starting. And if we eliminate the flavors, you're gonna eliminate a whole host of kids that don't want to use it and have it be tobacco flavored. They have no interest in that. 80% of the time, they're getting into it 80% of the time because of the flavor. So I just want to throw that out there as an area of focus that I think is going to be a really, really critical next step in making some progress with that.
And it primes the brain also for future use in vaping marijuana, because you're used to vaping. It's not a far stretch.
It makes for a natural gateway, unfortunately.
Yes, well, and that's what we found, Matt, in our research at Johnny's Ambassadors. There just wasn't any education out there, and that's why we are building our own curriculum direct to youth for middle schoolers. You know, we found in our focus groups that 12 and 13-year-olds were still malleable in terms of their perceptions and ability to be educated about the harms of marijuana on their brains, and that's why we've targeted that age group. I think that's critically important.
Absolutely.
Let's see. Your comp and val slides show increased schizophrenia at age 26. Is this the age the disorder often surfaces? In other words, if they start when they're young, why does that jump up at 26, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to answer that, because usually what they find is if there is going to be a diagnosable psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, usually it has emerged by age 26. There are rare instances where it can emerge after that, but caution with that though. It is actually more common for it to start to emerge in the later teenage years. In the 17 to 20-year-old age range window is actually when you more commonly start to see symptoms of it. So think of the 26 as more of the tail end of when you'll start to recognize those symptoms, but oftentimes will start to emerge in middle adolescence in that 16 to 18-year-old age window, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Stephen Simmerville in Pueblo, Colorado testified that in the 1970s, they knew that pregnant moms who used cannabis gave birth to infants with brain abnormalities. So does this apply to embryonic brain development as well, Matt?
Yeah, you know what? Honestly, I'm always careful to speak outside of the research that I've done. I haven't done as much research on embryonic brain development in cannabis. Because I'm so passionate about teenagers that
Yes.
maybe my blinders have been a little too narrow in terms of really honing in on that adolescent brain development. It makes intuitive sense to me, but I don't want to speak out of turn with embryonic brain development when that hasn't been a lane of research that I've done.
I've read about it quite a bit, in just that there is still so much development being done from 0 to 2 in terms of neural connections and pruning as well in
Right.
those formative years, that it seems like it would follow. But again, I'm like you, more focused on teens.
Yeah.
Here's a comment. CBD works at many sites throughout the body, including in the brain. Therefore, it is technically psychoactive or brain active. It's just not intoxicating. And look to the FDA for evidence of safety and effectiveness. The benefits are often way overstated, and it can be problematic to be selling it without FDA approval. And Matt, I saw a show just recently with Dr. Oz and Dr. Phil, whose names were used incorrectly to endorse a company's CBD products, and they
Yep.
had it tested. And there, in fact, was very little CBD in there, but there were leads, toxins, and the chemist who tested it on national TV said this is not fit for human consumption.
Yeah, and I think that's why I always say buyer beware. And so I always say that because make sure you know your research, and if you're really going to pursue that, make sure you know what you're getting. But I always describe it as we are putting the cart way in front of the horse in terms of claims about what CBD is beneficial for.
Yes.
There are claims out there that are really just simply not backed by research, and that's what people have to be really aware of. Is we are still in the infancy of CBD research, and so people need to be mindful of that.
Okay, good advice.
Yeah.
I know the answer to this, I think, but is there any medical value for anything that has THC in it? I know, of course, Matt, there are a couple of FDA-approved medicines that are in pill or oil form, derived CBD, some synthetic THC for seizures, but as far as I'm aware, and I think Sativex is under FDA review that's being used now in Canada and the US for things such as pain and glaucoma, but even some of those studies have been disproven that, in fact, it does not help pain and can make pain worse. And even the National Association of Ophthalmologists do not recommend THC for glaucoma. So have you come across anything that has medical?
This might sound a little bold. THC is not medicine. CBD, nuance. Maybe I think there's going to be some emergence of effective uses of CBD. Particularly with teens, THC is never medicine. I don't know how to be more specific.
Would there ever be any reason, is any level of THC safe? I mean, I appreciate that if, let's say someone has a rare seizure disorder and they are prescribed an FDA-approved medication for that, that's fantastic. But isn't it true, Matt, that I don't know of any reason to vape or dab or use these concentrates for a medical purpose, correct?
No, because even if you look at, say, like cancer and some of the impact that increasing appetite and decreasing nausea that can come along with chemotherapy for cancer treatment. All of the benefits, it's kind of like how they compare, like the people drinking red wine. The primary benefits are coming from the grape, right? So the benefits that are coming in terms of anti-nausea and increasing appetite, that's all coming from the CBD. That's not coming from the THC. So that's why I say you have to be very careful in assigning where the medicinal value is coming from. Primarily, the medicinal value is going to be coming from the CBD and not from the THC.
And so in your professional opinion, there would be no level of THC that would ever be safe for a child to use?
No.
Thank you. Let's see, marijuana driving impairment is not necessarily dose dependent. It's a very complex pharmacology. In other words, she's saying that any use of marijuana would be harmful, right? It is your point that the more you use, the more harmful it is, but it would be harmful regardless.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And what I'm trying to say is that I think it's important to acknowledge that there is, in terms of the level of impairment, if you have somebody that uses a little bit versus somebody is kind of higher dose marijuana, kind of in that realm of where those psychotic symptoms can start to emerge, those delusions, paranoia, there's going to be a gradient of in terms of that level of impairment. If you have somebody that's, I'm not saying someone that is slightly high, that's safe to drive. Please don't get me wrong, but there is going to be a gradient relative to the amount of impairment that there is.
Wonderful. Okay. Who are Johnny's ambassadors? We are. Johnny's Ambassadors is the name of our nonprofit, a 501c3 that was established in May of 2020 after our son sadly died by suicide in November of 2019 as an outcome of using high-potency marijuana dabs. He unfortunately thought the mob was after him and that the FBI base wanted him, and he took his life. So we, all of us as Johnny's ambassadors, are educating just as Matt is an ambassador, and all of you on this call, sharing the word about the harms of marijuana on today's youth. And you can go to johnnysambassadors.org, and there's all kinds of ways that you can join us. Thank you for asking that. Let's see, if someone has ADHD and they stop smoking, I'm assuming marijuana, at the age of 25, can they still reverse damage? I've heard that people with ADHD have a 3-year developmental delay in executive function, perhaps that their prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed until later. You know, we've heard some 28, even 30 years old for males, for example. Do you know any of that research on ADHD?
I don't. I was going to kind of half joke there. That sounds like that person knows more about that than I. There's such an abundance of research that's out there, and good research that's out there, that it's easy for me to acknowledge at times my lane and just acknowledge that there's research out there that I haven't seen, and I never want to pretend that I'm an expert about something that I'm not. So I love the concept behind that, and what I will say about that is that I think even if it's somebody that stops at age 25, I still think that it's just like somebody who may be an alcoholic that stops drinking in their 30s. There's always going to be a brain repairing process that improves their functioning. That I don't want to make it sound like that if it's 25, then they're kind of out of luck. It's certainly not the case. There's always going to be some level of plasticity where they're going to gain a lot of their functioning, and there's going to be a lot of brain repair that still happens.
And a lot of the poor outcomes can heal as the brain heals, and perhaps not as bad as it would have been or would be had they continued their marijuana usage. It will always improve to some extent. Just may not 100% go back to the way it would have.
Exactly.
Can they do anything to heal the brain? If a young person has used, maybe they've used and they're in their late 20s and they want to heal their brain. Are there any therapies or things that they can do proactively?
Not that I'm aware of, but it sounds like a great next step in terms of research. And are there therapies? Are there supplements? Are there homeopathic ways that the brain? I don't think there is much research on that out there now, but I'd love that to be a next step within this.
That would be fabulous. Yeah. I think it's certainly with all the research that's been done just over the past few years, that may be something researchers become interested in, as the damages have been pretty much proven now. Yep. Comments, MPP and normal are the biggest obstacles to educating America. Yes, we are contending with the falsehoods of the marijuana industry every day. The Surgeon General also states that pot is indeed a gateway drug. Let's see, Dr. Amen Clinic does work on some brain repair therapies. So there's a suggestion I'm not familiar with. Let's see, the FDA says CBD can be full of impurities. So yes, just what you said, Matt, buyer beware. One more couple questions. Where can one go for genetic testing? I've heard of the Genomind. Do you know of others, Matt?
No, I don't. That's again, I'm certainly, I would love to if that person is interested, because that's probably an area that I should, because I talk about genetic testing. It's an area I want to investigate further as well, just to find out if there are advancements in that. Because can you imagine if we're in a world where every child is able to get tested for those specific variants within that? Because I know I would want to know that, because
yes, and then protect them more.
Yeah, I'm certainly going to be vigilant as it is. My oldest is 12 right now, but if you know that they're at that 7 times higher risk, that allows you, I think, to then pull in a prevention support system. And I'd love to see where it gets to the point where that gets identified, and then there's just naturally a built-in system of support around prevention that just automatically gets put into place because of that elevated risk.
That would be fantastic. Well, we are at the end of our time, and I will read one last comment, which is a thanks to you for this webinar, Matt. As a school nurse, I see the impact and the need for this type of parent and student education. Thank you for your passion, and thank you for the gift of your time and your talent and your amazing expertise. Thank you for being one of Johnny's ambassadors, Matt.
Great.
Thanks to all of you. We'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.